Okay, so this video is going to be a bit different than my normal videos, and that it's going to be more like a demo of how I draw clothing as opposed to just rattling off tips and tricks for the subject. This one was a bit harder than normal to explain because clothing is a topic that I tend to treat very randomly sometimes when I'm drawing it, but I'll get to that in a second. So for now, let's just get right into how I draw clothing folds. So the first thing I want to say is that whenever I'm drawing clothing, there are primarily two things that I always keep in mind, and those things are the tension points on the clothing and what force is being applied to said clothing. And for the layman, a tension point is simply a point on a piece of fabric where the fabric is either being pulled, pushed, twisted, or just held taut. So I'm going to use a very common example when demonstrating tension points, but it's very effective still. So here we have a towel or something, or just some piece of fabric, and I want to place a tension point right here at the top. So I have my tension point, and now I want to decide what force is going to be applied to this towel. And for now, we're just going to say that gravity is the force that is affecting this towel, and so it's going to be pulling it down towards the ground as it's being held in place by the tension point. So when I draw this towel now with those two things in mind, I can get a good idea of how this fabric will just sort of hang there as though it were pinned to a wall. And notice that the lines that represent the folds in the towel all lead either directly to or towards the tension point, and so personally, I treat it as though the tension point is like a vanishing point, and the folds in the clothing are like the perspective grid all pointing to and converging at the vanishing point, or in this case, the tension point. So now let's say that I want to keep the tension point the same, but instead of gravity being the force affecting this towel, I want a big gust of wind to be blowing on this towel in this general direction. Now with that in mind, I can draw the towel according to that force, and notice even still in this drawing that all of the folds will converge back to the tension point. And this can be seen in like this example where the tension point is in the armpit and all the lines that represent the folds will converge at that tension point. So these two things, the tension points and the force being applied to the clothing, are the two things that will permeate throughout every drawing of clothing that I make. And real quick, just to throw it out there, the most common tension points on the human body, I feel like, are the joints on the body or anywhere where the clothing can be hitched, like taut. So that's like the armpits, the elbows, the wrists, knees, maybe even the ankles, and also probably even like the trap area near the neck. But it really depends on the pose you're drawing and other factors, of course. So with this first demo, here I have just the placement of the arms and the head, and when I start to think about the clothes, I have to establish where the tension points are, and in this instance, the two I can think of right off the bat is here at the elbows and here at the neck. And so at the elbows, the folds that I draw will kind of just outline the contour of the arm, since the clothing is of course wrapped around the arm. And at the neck, the folds will take the form of a diaper fold due to the shoulders being raised and thus squishing the clothing together towards the neck, but still ultimately converging at that tension point. From here, the process is pretty much the same for every part of the clothing for me, and it's really just identifying the tension point and establishing the force being applied to the clothing, because the force informs the folds that appear on the clothing and the tension points inform what direction those folds will be going. Now you might be saying to yourself, okay, that's all fine and good, but how do you know where the fold lines will come from exactly, or how do you know where to place them and what shape the clothing itself will be and all of that fun stuff? This actually leads me to the first real tip of the video, and it's to pay special attention to the outer contour of the clothing that you're drawing. Let's take this sleeve, for example. The sleeve itself doesn't really have any variation in the outline of the actual sleeve. All the lines that describe the sleeve are pretty much just straight lines, and thus doesn't convey any information as to what kind of folds there are in this sleeve. Now, you can try to convey that by drawing lines within the outline to maybe describe those wrinkles, but if we covered this drawing completely in black, you'd probably just assume at first glance that there aren't any folds in this sleeve, let alone where they might be within the silhouette. So conversely, if I draw the same sleeve but with slight variations in the outline itself, now it's a completely different situation, because when I go to draw the lines of the folds within the outline, I no longer have to guess where they might be or make up anything random, because the outline now informs the placement of those lines. And even if they are random, because let's face it, sometimes clothing folds can appear absolutely random sometimes, that randomness is informed, or what I like to call controlled chaos. If we covered both of these drawings now all in black, you'd be able to tell immediately that the one on the right not only has visible folds, but you can tell exactly where those folds are taking place just by looking at the outline. And again, the outline itself will inform where to place those wrinkles and folds. Even if you use perhaps random lines like this one, the outline just makes that randomness more believable. So if I put some random lines over on this sleeve, I can make them way more believable just by making slight variations in the outline of the sleeve according to where on the sleeve those lines are pointing to. So random but informed, controlled but chaos. But how do you know what outline to make for the clothing, or is it also just random shapes? Personally, I think the answer is yes and no. Clothing folds aren't like math, where the amount of folds and wrinkles is as quantifiable as 1 + 1. There are just so many possible permutations that any clothing folds and wrinkles can take that there is indeed a level of randomness to it that we as artists allow ourselves to get away with. This is why we often just use visible patterns to make sense of the clothing folds instead of hard equations to know exactly what folds a bent elbow will create, where they will fall, and how many there will be. This leads me to the next segment of this video, where I'll try to explain this technique that I personally use, which is what I call the staircase method. So here we have the outline of a flight of stairs. Pretty simple stuff, but the drawing's not done yet. So how do we complete this drawing of a staircase? Well, hopefully you'd have assumed the obvious, which is to just draw the lines in between from point to point like this, and now we have stairs. Or, with just a little shift in the way you see these stairs, you actually just drew the top of a cape. Now, of course, there's a bit more to it than that to make it look more like an actual cape. However, this line of thinking, completing the staircase, is the same line of thinking I use to draw the outline of clothing as well as the folds themselves. So for this example, I'm just going to draw what looks like a flight of stairs, or at least a stair-like pattern. And I even like to imagine that there is like a little stick figure that's climbing those stairs, just to really burn that idea in my head. And this flight of stairs is going to serve as the outline of a bunched up sleeve that looks something like this, and so now I have an outline of a sleeve. If we go back to the staircase for a second, in order to complete the staircase, pay close attention to where the lines on the inside of this outline will originate from. The origin point will be right at the inner corners of the outline, and so from here, if I just connect the dots essentially from corner to corner, then we complete the staircase, or again, we complete the cape. So from this, I can kind of surmise that wherever there is a corner in your outline, there will be a fold either coming from it or a fold pointing toward it. So back to the sleeve, I just identify the inner corners of the stairs, and I just extend a line from that point in that corner, and I get clothing folds. So for my second demo, here I have the head and the placement of the hands for the pose. Once again, I identify my first tension point, which is almost always the armpit. So I'll draw lines coming from the shoulder down to the tension point. These are wrinkles that you typically find in clothing, like in this picture of me, for example. Now for the sleeves, I'm literally just going to draw a flight of stairs, since to me personally, anytime I was studying how to draw bunched up clothing, the outline just always looked like stairs. So that's why in this instance, because the sleeve is bunched up, I draw a stair pattern. From here, I'll identify the corners of those stairs, which are here, and I draw lines from those corners to the tension point at the armpit. And with this corner, since it's the farthest from the tension point, the fold it creates won't be as tense or taut as the ones closest to the tension point. The tension point is kind of like the epicenter of an earthquake. The closer you are to the epicenter, the stronger the earthquake is, and the farther you are, the less shaking you'll feel. So because the origin point of this fold is the farthest away from the tension point, it won't be a straight line like this, but it'll more loosely fall downward, but still converging at the tension point. And now I have the first sleeve of the drawing, and the second sleeve is literally the exact same process. Now with the cloak that this character is wearing, I'm going to take the tension point near the armpit and draw my stairs again. I established the corners, and I'm literally just connecting the dots from this point forward, but making sure to vary up how those dots connect so as to just vary up the look of the folds in an informed, random way. With this example, I want you to take a look at this piece of paper. Now, when I fold this piece of paper, notice the outline of that fold creates a C-curve. This exact same thing happens with clothing folds. So in this drawing, instead of drawing just a line from the corners of those stairs, I'm going to draw an enclosed C-curve just like with the paper. You can even see this take place in this picture of me, where the contour of the folds creates this C-curve-like line with every fold. And also notice that the inside of these C-curves is noticeably darker than the rest of the shirt, meaning that wherever there is a fold, there will be a shadow accompanying it. So you can actually do this lineless by just painting in those shadow shapes that the C-curves create instead of actual lines. And doing this, you'll notice that in these empty areas that aren't in shadow, if you drew a line through those areas like a maze, it creates that zigzag pattern that is often found in bunched up clothing. And these are often patterns that I keep in mind when I'm painting clothing folds. Now, when it comes to drawing free-flowing fabric, the best example I can think of for that is one of my favorite things to draw, which are capes. And whenever I draw capes, I treat it as though I were drawing like a big ribbon. So the first thing I do is to just draw the very edge of the cape. And again, I just imagine as though I'm drawing a ribbon or even just a sheet of paper, specifically paying attention to what is the top of the fabric and what is the bottom of the fabric. So here I draw the very edge of the cape first, and then basically the other edge on the other side of the cape. And so this side is the top of the cape, and this whole area is the bottom of the cape, the underside of it, which will be completely in shadow. And this is how I draw free-flowing fabric, and in this case, a cape. With this example, I draw the outline of the cape first, and the wrinkles on the inside of the outline are honestly just completely random. There wasn't really any rhyme or reason to the lines that I put in there, but it is informed randomness, because remember what we said earlier, wherever there's a corner in the outline, there will be a fold coming from it or a fold pointing toward it. So while the direction these lines take are completely random, they all still come from a corner or point towards the corners of the outline. So even if you have an outline that doesn't look like stairs, like with this cape, just identify where the tension point is, which is this general area in this case, and identify all the corners in your outline. Wherever there's a corner, there will be a fold. So from here, I'll just draw lines coming from those corners that ultimately converge at the tension point at the top. With this example, you can see that there are many corners in this outline, which means there will be lots of folds and wrinkles in this cape. But since I don't really know how many wrinkles and folds there will be exactly, this will be one of many cases where I will employ a little bit of informed randomness and just draw random lines on the inside of the outline, but always making sure that these lines converge towards the tension point and either coming from or point towards the corners of the outline. And this is how I get fabric that is random but informed. Again, chaos but controlled. And that's going to do it for this video on how I draw clothing folds. If you like this video, consider hitting the like button and subscribe to my channel for more unorthodox tutorials like this. This might actually be one of those subjects that I revisit in the future just because there are so many ways to depict clothing folds and so many kinds of clothing folds in general, but I hope you were able to glean anything from this video for now. As always, I'd like to thank my patrons for their support this past month, and of course I'd like to thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you guys again as soon as I can.